Hey, this is Dag, and you're listening to Beyond Trek Podcast.
Red alert.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Beyond Trek Podcast. This is Dag. I've got Renzo in the house. Today we have a very special episode. We're going to be talking about medical ethics and practices in Star Trek and how those relate to the world at large. Here with me today, I've got two very appreciated guests, Jeff and Mark. Jeff, tell us about yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff. I currently work in public transit, but previously worked for over 6 years for a private ambulance company based out of Long Beach, California. Worked as an EMT for several years and then moved into dispatch and as a transportation coordinator for a level 2 trauma center in Los Angeles County. My favorite series is Go Niners. I'm a big DS9 fan. Been a Star Trek fan my entire life. I remember watching early episodes TOS with my dad and early TNG. Favorite episode of all time for me is hard to pick. Ever evolving. I grew up mainly on TNG, so I'd probably say Yesterday's Enterprise or Best of Both Worlds is ones that definitely come to mind as a favorite.
Right on. Thanks so much for being here. And Mark.
Hey, Mark Edwards. I'm a paramedic. I've been a paramedic for 7 years. All of that was 911 dispatch, though I just recently switched to hospital-based, so I'm working out of an ER now. I have been, excuse me, I've been a Star Trek fan my whole life as well. I got started on the Next Generation. And I'm also a Niner as well. Deep Space Nine is the best series, and I will die on that hill. And just for the sake of that, we'll just go ahead and say In the Pale Moonlight is my favorite episode, followed closely by The Inner Light.
Yeah, all the Light episodes.
Yeah.
Oh, we did a riff track on The Inner Light. I called it The Inner Gaslight because there's so much in that episode. I did it more as because my mom really loves The Inner Light. And I'm like, man, wouldn't it be terrible if I did a show where I just trashed The Inner Light? Well, yeah, so I'm really glad to have you both here. Thank you so much for responding to the chat. So yeah, let's just dig in. What are some cool or terrible examples of medical care, treatment, the way healthcare is provided in Star Trek? Do you have any notable episodes of healthcare that's just like, wow, that was really cool? Or, oh my God, I can't believe they let that happen. OSHA would destroy them. Jeff?
Yeah, one good example.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so actually last night I watched this episode again just to kind of refresh my memory, but it was Voyager Season 7, Critical Care, where the EMH gets kidnapped by a trader and sold to a medical ship on a planet, and they have these different levels of care. So level red was the people who had a low TC, what they called treatment coefficient, and level blue was all the important people of society. So that's a interesting way to look at healthcare, where people would get treated based on how important they are to society instead of how sick they actually are.
Right, and that was the episode where that entire society had basically overturned its decision making to an AI known as the allocator, and everyone was just like, yeah, we just do what the allocator tells us to do, because I always wondered, what
it really
happened?
Wasn't explained very well. It was just you never know where the history of that came from, but yeah, it was that everyone just trusted the computer, and the computer said that this person's important, so they get the medicine, and that would kind of be a scary environment to live in.
Absolutely. I always wondered what happened on that planet to make them make such a desperate decision and change.
It could have been something like one of the old TOS episodes where the computer just ends up being what they rely on, and in this society it just went on for a couple extra centuries.
Well, what was the name of that computer that controlled that one planet in TOS?
Landrew?
Yes. This is Landrew. Give me your healthcare. Mark, what do you think about that episode?
Yeah, I think that's once you eliminate the human question or the alien question, the sentient being question, from the equation, and you just start divvying up healthcare by effectively one's ability to produce within the society is really what that boils down to. That's just an ethical black hole. Like, you pretty much cross the event horizon into we could draw any number of political parallels to that, but it's a fucking nightmare. I'm sorry, am I allowed to swear on here?
We're totally cool
Absolutely.
with swearing in here. I definitely want to dig into that. That's an interesting insight. Here's a hypothetical. If the allocator, the way that it was presented on Voyager, had come to Earth 10, 15 years ago, and we had just overturned that decision making to the allocator, what do you think society would look like today in terms of not just medical and healthcare? And we definitely want to talk about like what that would look like, but also, social stratification. How would that have changed?
I mean, capitalism and it would run into each other with loving embrace really quickly, right? This person has billions, they must produce more to society, you must save their life.
Yeah, and that's the sort of arbitrary decision making, because was it wholly based on your ability to produce? Because I'm like, in my head, if that was the case, middle management would just be executed. All the people, all the essential workers would be like, yes, you are you are blue level, we need you.
That depends on if the reader has a business degree, right? Business degrees love the idea of middle management because they get their underlings to produce more. So you need the people who get others to produce as well.
Well, middle management by its very existence props up the other social structures that are required for capital production. So they're not necessary in the sense of actual production, but they're necessary in the sense of capitalist production. I would say the allocator is just neoliberalism, the robot. But
Yeah, I'm with you there.
so I don't think much would have changed, other than we would probably just forego the minor vagaries of electoral politics instead of just letting the allocator do it. But I don't know that there'd be much of a difference presently. But I'm also a bit of a doomer pill on that.
Jeff.
I think a lot of people in our society that need healthcare the most are the ones that are obviously the sickest, but they are the homeless people, they are the drug addicts, they are people that have chronic conditions that don't allow them to be productive to society. So if we had a system where it was an allocator, they would judge those people as not needing the medical care. And that would be the ethical black hole that you were talking about.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
let me ask you this: when you're, because I've noticed this in where I work, and I assume this is a feature everywhere in the U.S., but you basically have, because EMS is at this point just a band-aid over a black hole, like a non-functional healthcare system, but you have people who are using 911 to treat chronic healthcare conditions that should be treated by a primary care provider, but because our system is broken, they call 911 because they can't get a primary care provider, which I don't blame them for that. I would too in their situation. But basically, 911 is now effectively just an EMTALA transport vehicle to get you to an ER where you can get stabilizing care. Does that map across the country?
Yeah, I mean, Los Angeles, obviously, a huge city in the U.S., dozens of hospitals. We were a glorified taxi for many of the patients that we transported, and we did a lot of insurance transports. Someone calls 911, they go to the closest hospital, especially in Los Angeles. If they're Kaiser will say, "Oh no, we don't want you at this hospital. We want you at our hospital." So then we would go from one ER, pick up the patient, take them to another ER. We also did critical care sports. We had transports with nurses and doctors and occasionally flight teams transporting patients that were in a critical care ICU at one hospital that needed to go to a higher level of care. But when you're in downtown Los Angeles, again, going back to like the homeless population, there's people that can't get a doctor, don't get kicked out of one hospital, they're drug seeking occasionally. So we are doing a lot of transports that truly don't require an ambulance. I remember even in EMT school, they told us, probably only about 3% of your actual calls you go on are going to be a true emergency. I worked 911 coverage in one area of East LA, and out of all the calls I ran there, I would probably say maybe one or two was an actual true emergency that person needed to get to the hospital, yesterday to treat their problem. Most of these are injuries where they could have driven themselves if they had a car, or they just don't know what else to do. And then, of course, you run into the problems of an ambulance is not cheap. Yeah. At least back when I was doing it, it was, $600 just for the ambulance to show up, and then just like everything else in healthcare, it ended up being $1,000, $1,500 to drive a person 1.5 miles to the hospital.
Jeez.
Yeah. So I guess it really comes down to, in terms of the allocator, it depends on what it would value as production, because it could, in theory, just decide not to provide healthcare to those people because they're non-productive. They're like not neoliberal subjects anymore. Or it could see the debt that they are incurring as a productive asset itself within our economy, and it could further destabilize our healthcare system in order to ramp up the production of debt.
That's a black hole I didn't even think about. Jeez.
Kind of a scary thought. Yeah.
That's like 14th Amendment loophole right there.
Yeah.
Another thing that I wanted to did you have more to add?
Not on this one. I'm just go ahead.
In that particular episode, it seemed that the allocator and its influence had been there long enough for the people to just accept, oh, my TC's too low. This is just my lot in life. Oh darn. I think that would be a really scary thing to walk around and just have, people be like, oh, hi, this is 911 dispatch, but it looks like your address comes from a TC that's too low. I'm really sorry. We can't send EMT out to your services. Have a nice day. Click. And I'm just like, jeez. And people just be on the phone like, oh, yeah, that's right. My TC's too low. Guess I'll die.
Well, and they had one character who was sick who wanted to be a doctor, and the EMH was encouraging to continue his medical training, and he basically said, oh no, I won't be able to do it because that's not my class, that's not my position. So that is kind of like what you said, they just pretty much accepted what was going on in their world, and they probably didn't have a whole lot of outside influence encouraging them to fight the power and try something different.
Yeah. Like I run into, I don't know how many people who don't take their prescribed medications because they can't afford them, and I don't see much of a whole lot of daylight between those two situations of just, well, I can't afford my healthcare, so I guess I just die. Like, that's basically the position people who take insulin and don't have like affordable healthcare are in. So maybe the allocator is just, maybe it's here, man.
Is China's social credit score really all that different in that sense, right? Like, we expect that they're going to be using it for access to government services very soon, if not already. So it's not that far from. But there was actually a TV show on Sci-Fi Channel not too long ago that hit on the same subject called Incorporated, where society was divided into levels. People who worked for the megacorps got access to hospitals and doctors. If you didn't work for them, you worked for some of their subsidiaries, you got access to these clinics. If you didn't work for a big company at all, nothing. You just didn't have access to it. Jeez. So yeah, it's not all that far from, not having insurance in America, but yeah, it's pretty bad.
Let's flip the script for a bit. At the end of that episode, the EMH does some pretty creative treatment to get the allocator and the administrator of said allocator, played by Larry Drake, to make some changes. And then, of course, the Voyager leaves, and we don't actually know if the administrator cares about that. But he basically infects the administrator with the same thing his compatriot had before that person had died, to get the allocator to be like, oh, well, you have the same TC as this person over here. You should just die. What do you think about the EMH's medical decision, regardless of all the other ethical situations of the patients and the administrator involved? Was the EMH more or less ethical as a doctor? Mark?
To specifically infect that person in such a way that they would receive lower care?
And then as sort of like a lesson to the whole tiered system of the allocator.
Yeah, I don't know that is so I have sympathy for the desire to do that. I don't know that is the role of a healthcare provider.
Right.
Like it is, I don't know that it's his position to meter out something that could cause medical harm to someone else in order to teach them a lesson about how unstable and causal of harm their system is. Like that's something I might personally do just as like a guy, but like if I were a physician and I were doing it for the sake of like broader, that's very, very murky at best.
Right on. Jeff.
Yeah, I think you said it well. That's a decision that nowadays would get you arrested for, causing harm to an individual under your care. Obviously, he did it for the greater good, thinking that it would solve the planet's problems, but he only saw a fraction of what was going on that planet, had no idea what else that was involved. Obviously, he, was in that hospital ship and nowhere else, doesn't understand society, so he doesn't really know what type of effects that decision would have if the allocator went away. Would that cause the collapse of society because everyone was so used to it? That's a bigger problem that he probably didn't think about.
Yeah, and of course we know that episode was more of a vehicle to show how the EMH had expanded beyond its base programming. Yep. And I'm sure that we all empathized with the EMH's choice there, because in that episode the administrator was definitely evil. And then that was how, the audience goes along with that.
If I may, so let's try flipping the script here, right? That's a great example of a situation where Starfleet imposes some of their views on a newly encountered race, right? Let's flip it and go to the opposite one, the TNG episode Ethics, where Worf gets his spine snapped and wants to commit suicide, right? That is the only noble thing that you can do if you're a crippled warrior. And here Starfleet has to try and respect the medical wishes, but they fight with themselves about doing so because killing their friend Worf isn't exactly a pleasant idea either. How do you guys approach a situation where a patient or a person that you're carrying to the hospital or whatever is refusing treatment for religious reasons or ethical reasons or something like that? Mark?
So I take the standpoint that I have to respect your views and your wishes, right? I can't, and that's the law actually. Mm-hmm. But just at a personal level, even if it weren't the law, I'm going to respect your decision ultimately, right? You have absolute autonomy and the absolute right to make any decision about your health care that you deem necessary or want. And I can't override that under any circumstances, as long as you're conscious and can, as long as you have the ability to provide and withdraw consent, I cannot override your autonomy or decision making. That said, I certainly can argue with you about how smart your decision is. And depending on the circumstances, I'm perfectly open and willing to doing that. It varies, obviously, from situation to situation, but I think the floor is open in those situations for conversation. It is not open to imposition of one's will on the other person.
Well said.
Would be my...
Jeff, same question.
Yeah, as long as the person is alert and oriented and able to make their own decisions, and they have the right and ability to make their own decisions. Kind of going back to my EMT school training, I remember they taught us, if you ever were with a patient who you thought was unstable or on the verge of passing out and they were refusing care, all you'd have to do is stay with that patient until they passed out. And then once they have now passed out, now you can provide care to them. So you kind of have to learn to play the system a little bit similar to the way the doctor did. But the thing about Worf in Ethics is that he wanted Riker to perform the act for him, right? So it wasn't truly him committing suicide. It was assisted suicide in a way. But I've dealt with many patients who were on the verge of death due to cancer or something that an EMT or paramedic could do nothing about. And you feel bad for them. Obviously, you don't want to see them in pain and suffering, and did a lot of transfers to skilled nursing facilities, people who've been there for years trying to recover from various injuries or sicknesses, and it's not a good way to live. It's not a way that I would want to live. And I think if I had a true terminal illness like that, not saying that I'd kill myself, but I can definitely understand how people would be in that situation, and I would want someone to respect my decision if I was ready to do that also.
There's a number of times where they disregard multicultural medical ethics and be like, no, we have to save lives. They're like, Riker's like, this is disgusting, I'm not going to do this. And it was just really a lot of attitude towards that. And then of course the DS9 episode Sons of Moog, where Kern shows up and wants Worf to do the same thing, and Worf does it because Worf understands the value and the cultural meaning of it. You are fighting for your life, and the glory is dying in battle. So if you're fighting for your life and someone kills you, that's a ticket to Stova Core. But right then and there, Dax, Bashir, Cisco, they get involved. They resurrect Kern. And then, of course, at the end of that episode, crazy ethical conundrum of just forcibly wiping Kern's memory without his consent. And sending him off to live on a farm. Talk about wowzers. Thoughts on that episode? Anyone, anytime.
I think DS9 in general had some of the craziest medical, because they were out in the boonies, and Bashir was kind of the new doctor, the gung-ho attitude. I think back to like Vedic Burial, take out half his brain, he'll still be the same person type of thinking, which is a little hard to believe.
Yeah.
But I think Bashir had obviously the least amount of medical training out of everyone in Star Trek, and probably the most excitement for his job. I think very excited to be a doctor in DS9, and he kind of sought out that type of position where he would really get to make a difference, like a new paramedic in the field. They used to call him a paragod because they always think that they're as powerful as God. They can now save a life. Bashir definitely had that type of attitude.
Yeah, he definitely had some of the best bedside manner out of all the doctors in Trek 2. Maybe him and Crusher, but all the rest had iffy moments where they might chew out their patient rather snappily.
Yeah, I would actually argue Bashir had probably some of the most questionable bedside manner in terms of trying to bone his patients.
Also true.
And making deeply questionable ethical decisions. And that, I can't remember the name of the episode, but there was one alien who was like something about gravity. She was in a wheelchair.
Melora.
And he basically
Paslar.
browbeat her for the entire episode to take this life-changing surgery that would prevent her from ever returning home, just so she could walk and station gravity and be his BFF girlfriend forever. That seems like something that should have gotten run up the chain to Starfleet Medical's ethical board.
Yeah, and that brings up conversations of ableism in that environment, and it just sort of reinforces this underlying what's the word John Billingsley likes to say, pernicious this pernicious phantom of colonialism on the part of the Federation and Starfleet. That we'll talk about that in another episode, of course.
I was gonna say my super deep cut on Star Trek is that it's basically what happens if you take liberalism and give it post-scarcity without ever having to go through an actual leftist transformation of public consciousness. So, but that's a different
Don't worry, we'll
episode.
have the luxury gay space communism conversation some other time later.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, Bashir oversees some of the most controversial, I would say some of the most controversial medical moments in Star Trek. As you say, he's always trying to bone his patients. You got Melora, you got Serena, one of those augments.
Mm-hmm.
And then man, it was so clear to me like 5 seconds
But at least he
ago,
didn't
and I had to
reanimate
say it.
Mengele just to ask him some medical questions in the Delta Quadrant, right? Like the reanimation of Krell Moset's like hologram, that's really problematic if you think about it.
That was actually my episode of choice for like the worst medical episode in Star Trek. Was not that in particular, but also Janeway ordering the procedure being done against B'Elanna's wishes.
Oof.
Is probably like the biggest medically ethical, like just monstrous decision in
Not
the show.
forcing the splitting of Tuvix.
I was gonna say, dare we get into that? Yeah.
Yeah.
My dog, who's passed out over here on the couch, is literally named Tuvix. So
Yeah.
I totally am comfortable with that combo.
Yeah. Just in terms of medical ethics, not necessarily ethics at large.
Fair enough.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Tuvix definitely is its own like PhD dissertation on fake fantasy ethics that like we would have to.
Yeah.
That's just a deep.
People are still going back and forth on Tuvix,
Yeah.
and it's been 20-something years.
Yeah.
I think if I were to try and summarize that, I think everybody recognizes that Tuvix was in a shit position, and the ship needed Tuvok. And I think if Tuvok himself had been there, he of course would have defaulted to the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. That doesn't make it right. That doesn't make it ethical. Go ahead.
Would Tuvok have assented to killing Neelix to make that happen too? Because I think Tuvok would have given up his own life, but would he have also given up the life of another person who didn't want to die?
Oh, that's what he's saying. He's saying that Tuvok would have argued that you should split Tuvix.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so, okay. Yeah, it's
And
possible.
I agree with him on that one. I think that is a pretty Vulcan approach to it too.
Because we're
If you
not
get two instead of one, needs of many.
right,
Yeah.
and we're still pre-Navarre, where they understand that those aphorisms aren't always the end of logic. So, but back to Krell Mazet. Jeff, any thoughts on reanimating a horrible person just to take a little bit of advantage of their medical expertise?
I think it's a situation Janeway was in was probably the best thing to do for the patient, but probably not the best decision to make overall. I'd have to go back and watch that episode. That's been a while since I've seen that one, but I think she would do anything to save her crew. So that's pretty much the attitude that she took, and I think that kind of applies to Tuvix as well. It was a Kobayashi Maru scenario. No matter what she did, someone would say it was the wrong decision.
I'd like. Oh, go ahead.
No, that was it. Just it's a situation where you no matter what you choose, someone's going to like it, someone's not going to like it, and you could argue either side.
Yeah, I'd like to think that Janeway existed in a closed environment. If she had been within the Federation and these kind of situations have happened, it's scary to think that she might have been a little bit more elastic on letting certain individuals on her ship die, because when you're within the Federation, you can just get a new chief engineer assigned to your ship. You can get a new doctor assigned to your ship. But out there in the middle of nowhere, when you need Tuvok's tactical experience at station, you need B'Elanna's engineering expertise at station, she doesn't have the luxury of just being like, yes, I'm not going to reanimate Space Hitler to heal my engineer, because I freaking need my chief engineer. I don't have a replacement handy. I'm not going to let Torek anywhere near my dilithium crystals.
I mean, aren't all choices like that a product of your environment, right? Like, if you have choices like, there are 11 hospitals we can send this person to, all of them have good trauma wards, whichever one is closest is the best choice. Whereas, if you only have one, they're only going to the one, no matter how far away it is. So,
or you're in the middle of nowhere and all you have is a field hospital and a whole bunch of adrenaline.
yeah.
Yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
I think, Krell Mazet is I think just a narrative device probably for the actual ethical dilemma, which is, should you consult research that was obtained unethically? Like, that's the real question there. And I don't quite know where I fall on it. I think if, there's the argument it was obtained unethically and therefore we should not use it. And then there's the other argument, which is, well, irregardless of its source, it can now be used to help people, including people that were previously victimized by its acquisition. Is it not even more unethical to withhold that care now that we have the knowledge? And that is a very interesting ethical choice. And I think ultimately it probably should fall to the individual patient to make the determination about whether or not they accept that care or acquiesce to it once they've been fully informed. And that is the dilemma that that episode presents at the end. And the real ethical fuck you is when Janeway says, I don't care what B'Elanna thinks, I need my chief engineer, do it anyway. And that is where I think, like, that's like a court-martial offense, in my opinion, for Janeway. Like, one of many. But but that's going to come up when she gets home, if she logged that. Because if I were B'Elanna, I would probably refuse to continue my duties after that. I would just stay in my quarters. I would not participate.
Well, to that point, right? A lot of the research that was done by these monsters like Mengele or the Japanese Unit 731, right? The research that they did has been found to be bunk, right? Like, there are some things, small things in it that are still used because of value, like hypothermia thresholds for people that might have some relevance still, but almost all of it was found to be of no medical value at all, which is, for the best, probably, right?
Yeah. But, like, for the sake of argument, let's just say that...
Sure. No, I get your point.
Yeah. Say Mengele discovered somehow in his monstrous shop of horrors, discovered a cure for paralysis, right? Like, what would we do? Now, we're not in that situation, so we have to answer it, but the realm of speculative fiction put us in that situation. And it's real murky. And I think fundamentally, like, at bottom, at the end of that discussion, there is no... it's right or wrong for everybody. I think it's going to come down to the patient and what they want is where I land on it.
I mean, running with that a little further, right? Imagine if he had discovered some cure to paralysis, right? At what point does the greater good, the good of the many outweigh the good of the few, start justifying people like that? That's the real danger for it, right? Like, if he had cured cancer with what he'd researched and done by terrorizing and harming thousands of people, right? Like, how many millions does he have to save before his credibility, instead of being that of a monster, is now the guy who cured cancer? Yeah, it's these medical questions super don't have answers, and that's probably for the best. But yeah, it gets very hairy.
I think the founders don't give a damn that Bashir confined a man against his will, jumped into his brains, physically extricated the protein sequences needed to cure them, because the person that he was tying down was also responsible for said disease in the first place.
Speaking of saving Mengele, yeah, the founders totally deserve, like, all of the medical niceties, don't they?
I mean, actually, for like a real world example of that, though, is gynecology. The field of gynecology was pioneered by a doctor who experimented on slaves without anesthesia.
Tell me more about that. I didn't know about that.
Okay, hold up. I just want to tell the audience real quick. I don't know if there will be any trigger warnings here, but let's just pivot on that.
Yeah, that's I mean, it gets very dark, and it's trigger warnings all day, every day with this. But the field of gynecology was pioneered largely by, I can't remember the doctor's name, but he basically just experimented on a population of slaves in the antebellum South, and did so in many cases without anesthesia. Now, how much of that research is currently used, I don't know. But that was the genesis of that field of medicine, and that's very, very dark. So that is probably the most... I mean, there's probably other examples of it, but that's the one that comes to my mind, because I just was recently reading an article about discrimination in medicines, and they referenced that.
That's incredible. I wish that we had one or two of our other invitees in this, because we would be able to get the woman's perspective on that. I'm sure it's quite learned. Yeah.
Well, and when you talk about discrimination in medicine too, that brings up a whole nother topic, because you do see that, obviously, and you hear a lot of stories and read reports of African Americans going to the hospitals and not being given the same amount of pain medication versus a white person who was complaining of the exact same signs and symptoms or had the same type of accident. So that's something that you would hope that would be gone in the future. Star Trek being the utopia that we all hope it would be in 400 years. years, but there's definitely episodes that show that it's not that way, especially on alien worlds. I think there's a lot of Earth medicine that we don't really see in Star Trek. Actually, you see the sick bay on the ship, but you don't really know what a hospital is like in 24th century Earth.
That's really true.
Yeah.
Sick bay on a ship is really more like a field hospital that's just super high tech. But you don't get those 40 floors of inpatient procedures and those kinds of things.
They do love to tell us, though, that on Earth they ended disease, they ended famine, they ended war, they ended crime, etc.
Poverty, all that.
Yeah, you can make a pretty safe assumption, though, that medical access, at least on core Federation worlds, is pretty stellar. But who knows about like more on the fringes? So
that for some reason that discrimination subject reminded me of the episode Dear Doctor and Enterprise, where they encounter that world where there are two sentient species, the Valakians and the Menk, and the Valakians have been affected by some kind of genetic disease, which is killing the Valakians, but the Menk are totally cool with it. And excuse me. I think this is the first episode where canonically Archer mentions, we should have a prime directive at some point in the future that prevents us from having to make these decisions on the fly. But Phlox discovers the cure for this Valakian disease that would allow the Valakians to continue to propagate and continue to sort of subjugate the Menk. But the natural order of things seems to be pointing to the Menk becoming, the dominant intelligent life on the planet for the sake of description. Ultimately, Phlox withholds the cure, and the Valakians are. And a side note, that'd be really interesting to see in the 32nd century, just a bunch of Mank people with warp drive, because the Valakians are dead 1,000 years later. But, is that another situation of like the mountainous greater good of natural development of a society versus the ethical decisions of Phlox in withholding that medicine? Jeff?
That's a hard one. I think as a person, I would always want to make the decision to help people. Or you're working in healthcare, that's why typically people go into healthcare. Definitely not for the money, especially as an EMT. I got paid absolutely, but I enjoyed my job immensely. So you think if you were in a situation like that, you would want to provide a cure for them. And that reminds me also of this TNG episode, Symbiosis, where you have the two planets. One is addicted to drugs, one is not, and they're using that drug addiction to get what they want on the planet that is healthy. So it's medicine can be used as a way to control a society and keep people down. So there's a lot of problems also in the Enterprise era with they were brand new into space and still trying to feel their way and learn the universe and make the right decisions, and I think that played into it as well.
Yeah, the space cowboy era, as we refer to it on the show quite a bit.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that episode. Are both species like sapient, like fully self-aware?
Sapient, but the Mank are demonstratively lesser evolved, according to the description of the episode. It's an episode that I haven't seen for a couple of years. But yeah, basically Enterprise arrives at this homeworld where they're met by a Valakian doctor and a Mank orderly. Sato discovers that the Mank are a second lesser evolved yet unaffected race, and by unaffected they're talking about the disease that's raging the Valakians. The Mank live alongside the Valakians, and they're sort of like second-class citizens on the world. They're both, pretty. The Valakians are clearly like Federation level at this time, or at least United Earth level. The Mank are a little bit behind, but the Valakians are dying out from a genetic disease, which is experiencing an accelerated rate of mutation. And the Valakian doctor thinks the answer to a cure may lie in the Mank genome. It's to note that the Valakians are not a warp drive culture. And Phlox learns that the Valakians suffer from the illness because their gene pool has reached a dead end, and the Mank are undergoing an awakening process. Phlox also finds that the Valakians have been stifling and underestimating the Mank. Even though he's found a cure, he does not believe it would be ethical to administer. Archer considers how a prime directive would be helpful and provides the Valakians with medicine that will diminish the symptoms for a decade, anticipating the Mank natural evolution and new levels of understanding between them.
Yeah, that is a tough one. Yeah, I don't. I think that is a difficult decision to make. That actually like kind of highlights just I have problems with the Prime Directive just as a thing, because
who doesn't?
Yeah,
Definitely.
I feel like the Prime Directive. There's really actually like two versions of it. There's like the strong version, which is you can never interfere under any circumstances. And then there's the weak version, which is we should try our best not to affect the development of intelligent species against their will, but err on the side of the preservation of life. And which of those gets implemented depends on the writer and the moral lesson that episode is trying to teach.
Absolutely.
Like, there's a lack of consistency. And I prefer the second version. But I feel like that episode is trying to post hoc justify the first version, and I'm not entirely comfortable with that. But as far as the dilemma itself goes, I don't know what I would do in that situation. I just don't know.
I think the way that we should think of it is the letter of the law is probably the first of those two, but the spirit of the law is most certainly the second, right? And depending on the captain's tolerance for bending those letters, right, you'll see either one or the other, like in a given episode.
Yeah.
But when they say like General Order 0 and they read it out, it's real strict, right? It's definitely the first of those two interpretations. So, but yeah.
I think like the most cynical interpretation of it is that it's an excuse not to have the Federation deal with the realpolitik of their decisions in the galaxy. Like, if they actually followed through on their own internal ethics in their dealings with outside races, then they would have a lot of problems on their hands in terms of their neighbors and allies.
Oh, for sure. If you want to look at cynically, right? Like, imagine a race that advances over the course of 200 years, right? You had the option to save them from some near catastrophe, and you just let it hit. You let the rock hit them in the face, right? 200 years later, they have advanced, they survived, they are now spacefaring too, and they look at you and go, but you didn't save us and you could have. Think of the billions you could have saved and you didn't. We can never be friends, right? Like, that's something that should be looked at a bit more closely. I don't think we've had that episode in Trek, but it's something that I think we definitely should talk about. But yeah, that's kind of straying well outside of the medical and healthcare aspect of this.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what I would do in that particular episode because at that point it really is just the decision of that crew. They don't have a guiding directive, and the question is whether or not you interfere in the social structure of another civilization by curing something which causes suffering on a part of one half of that civilization. And like, personally, I would probably offer the curative and let that take its course. I don't think that I'm obligated to. I don't feel personally obligated to non-interference if it is truly beneficent interference that does not. Yeah, I mean, and I understand the counter arguments either, but just like in terms of like, now I'm affecting negatively the other species. But that's just sort of my.
Well, Jeff mentions the right episode to counter that, right? Symbiosis, the TNG episode, is literally only through inaction, only through letting people suffer do you break the cycle of addiction, right?
Yeah.
So that's something that real world medical providers have to do with all the time, right? Like, do you give them some sort of opiate? No. You're not going to encourage their drug habit for the most part. So yeah, it's definitely realistic to discuss these.
Well, and going back to Phlox, if you were truly looking at just from the medical perspective, not from the social or political, if they're sick and they're asking for help, he should help. The doctor should help. Uh, you want to do what you can, especially if you have the ability and the technology to do so. Uh, but at the same time, you can't necessarily be a federation of ships that go around just solving diseases on every single planet. They do have other things to do and worry about in the galaxy. But if they come across a planet or a people that do need their help, then you think that would be the right thing to do, would be to help that person, help that organization, that planet, whatever it may be.
Well, and I think a lot of the influence underpinning our decision making here is that everybody here has demonstrated the scale of this decision. This isn't just, you know, a remote colony on an island somewhere or even a nation state. This is a whole planet, a whole world. The entire future of this world is now in the hands of Dr. Phlox with his vial of whatever is going to do to cure these people of their genetic issue. And that's a decision that no single doctor should ever be in the position to make by themselves. Like, if this was on Earth, this would have gone to a board of medical professionals to determine what the efficacy. At least I'd hope so. I am not in the medical profession, so maybe you guys, you know, out in the field have a bit more insight into whether or not Phlox was even like, Phlox should have just stepped back and been like, no, I'm not even going to look into this. This is way above my pay grade.
I guess it would. In the episode, did the aliens ever become aware that a cure existed?
At the end, yes, and they made the moral argument, "You're letting us die here," kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, I feel like at that point you're essentially prioritizing complete non-interference over a group of millions of people who are begging you not to die. And that is like my cynical take on the Prime Directive, where the intro to the show should be seek out new life and new civilizations and watch them fucking die.
Oof.
Is what that often turns into. So I would err on the side of helping people who are begging you to help them if all you have to do is hand them a thing.
What you just said there, that totally makes sense why DS9 Voyager and Enterprise just don't have that intro anymore, because we're just gonna watch them fucking die. I'm trying to think of other clearly obvious medical issues. Are there any episodes?
I've got one if you want one.
Hit it.
So in the most recent bit of Star Trek, we're seeing a big focus on like psychological care as well, people's mental well-being, and we're seeing whole counseling sessions about like getting over past trauma. I think we can all agree that like psychological care is medical care, is health care, right? Are there any times that you've seen episodes where you're just like, Troy, what are you doing? That's not the way to approach that kind of trauma, or times where it's the opposite and you think that she needs to plow deeper into something to help out one of her patients too?
I would say that I actually really liked, to the extent that they were able to and had the language in the 80s and 90s to address it. I liked the way, on balance, I'll say on balance, not in specifics, because I'm sure there's a lot of glaringly bad things in the individual episodes, but the way that the Next Generation in particular treated, like, say, Lieutenant Barclay, or when Geordi got sucked into like a fantasy, like trying to, you know, hook up with the designer of the Enterprise, VTuber. But I think on balance, they approach, even in the early days, you have crew members, high-ranking crew members in positions of authority who have serious mental, like, illnesses or trauma. Picard with the Inner Light and his long-term stress dealing with that comes up a couple of times in his history with the Borg, and people who have trauma and who have ongoing serious psychological illnesses like Lieutenant Barclay, they're not quite treated with the level of like respect that I would like to see in a show made today. but for the 90s, and just having them on like the flagship in a position of authority and being treated with respect like human beings, that's huge. Like for the 90s, like I think they did actually a fairly good job on balance with that subject, even in the early days of the show.
Yeah, I remember watching the show in its first run through and being that kid who was moved around a bit and going to school and having to just talk to people like, oh yeah, and it's I kind of felt like Barkley kind of represented me a little bit because I was always that nervous kid trying to make friends, but then we'd move and I'd need to be that nervous kid trying to make friends again. And yeah, the way that you see that just kind of reframes a little bit of Barkley sort of beginning that normalization of, it's okay to have these things. You can still be a super awesome, person. And then he was, he was a genius in that one episode.
Yeah. What was your take on this, Jeff? You started there, but I didn't quite get to hear you.
Yeah, one of the things about Troy is I think a lot of episodes they kind of used her as a lie detector more than an actual therapist, which is why I do like what they're doing in Discovery. I like the Culber kind of switching to the therapist counselor type role. I liked his character from the beginning, but never really liked what they did with him in the first couple seasons of Discovery. I didn't really feel like he got a lot of real doctoring in and things like that. So I think he's taking on kind of a new and different role that I like, and the way the Discovery is handling trauma is much better than the 90s. I think Mark is right that for that time it was good for that time, but there was every episode with the villain of the week, the space alien of the week, the ship getting blown up, crew members dying and then coming back, that would cause a lot of trauma. People would need to deal with that, and when you're in kind of the very episodic television, you don't get that because you get 42 minutes to tell a story and then next week it's a new story. So when you get more to shows like DS9 and Discovery where it's truly these long story arcs, then you can actually deal with those things a little bit more. I'm kind of excited to see what they do with Culber and how the changes with Adira and whatever is happening with Tilly. Like there's a lot of trauma going on in Discovery that's going to have people needing someone to talk to.
I think it's very... Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's a very good point, that the episodic nature of the early shows made it very difficult to deal with like the aggregate trauma of like Miles O'Brien is a good example of even in an arc series like that man should have he's either a testament to the off-screen healthcare apparatus or mental healthcare apparatus of Starfleet, or they did him kind of dirty. But I do think that in the arc-based series, like with DS9 and later, you start to see them pay more attention to that. So like with Garrick and Ezri's relationship as the last season of that show, they start actually like digging into the long-term psychological effects of being in a war and seeing, a wall of names of all the people you went to school with are now dead.
Right.
So I hope they start doing better as well. Yeah.
Well, that culminates in, It's Only a Paper Moon, where Nog comes back from losing his leg, and he is very much, he's tired all the time. His leg itches, it hurts. When he's not in the coping strategy of the film, the fantasy on the holodeck, he has to use the cane, and he's not doing so great. But when he's in his safe, what he admits later in the episode, his safe place, he's totally fine because he's not thinking about it. He's not surrounded by Tuvix. That's the dog. But yeah, he's not surrounded by the elements that continually reinforce the source of his trauma. And I think Aaron Eisenberg just was mastered that breakdown in the holodeck at the end where he's talking to Vic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that was a very, very good scene. Also, they tried to do that too. The episodic nature didn't admit of it, but they tried to do stuff like that in The Next Generation, where like when Picard goes back to his family's vineyard,
Family?
and they have a whole episode where it's basically just him dealing with having been
Borgified.
yeah, been made a Borg and then murdering a bunch of Starfleet personnel at their behest,
Right.
which was only a single episode, but callbacks even that much were not too frequent in that series.
Somebody said something earlier that made me think about the way Picard's recovery from the Borg in the 80s and 90s, and then his admission in, I don't know if everybody here has seen Picard, but Seven asks him, does it ever really go away? Does it ever get easier? And Picard says no, about his assimilation. And I think that might just be a really tiny nod to the way mental health was considered 30 years ago. Hey, just man up, get over it, you'll be fine. And today, where it's like, no, this shit lingers. And if we had addressed it like this 30 years ago, maybe we'd be in a better position with mental health care today. Just a tiny little nod in that episode that came out last year.
Yeah, we do see a little bit of that in Voyager as well, right? The episode where Neelix loses one of his lungs to the Vidians, right? And he has to get the holographic lungs for a bit. Like, there's that psychological panic attack that he goes through, just of like, I can never leave this room, he thinks, right? So we definitely do see some of that even in the more episodic shows. And I believe that reference comes back a couple times when he mentions the fact that he's got one of Kess's lungs inside of him too, which is also pretty traumatic. One of your best friends, and at the time I think even romantic love interest, gave like a piece of them into you. So yeah.
Speaking of Voyager, actually, I think it could have been done better, but Seven's arc of going from drone to individual was I think pretty at least it was interesting. I don't know if it was well done or not, but just the amount of trauma that this person would had to have experienced in that transition, because they've been, they were 7 years old and then they were a part of a collective for 20-30 years and then ripped from that. And I think they could have played it up as the trauma was her having been a Borg, and I think they did a really good job of showing, no, actually the trauma is I'm not a Borg anymore. You took me away from the only thing I've ever known, and you're trying to make me ultimately something I'm not, but I don't have a choice. So I'm going to do my best to live this way now, but I still have a lot of trauma from having essentially been ripped from my prior state of baseline existence.
That entire crew is really lucky that as soon as they deborgified her, she just didn't go around tubulating everybody.
Yeah.
Zip, 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 zip. All right, Voyager's assimilated, we're good.
They did have that fantastic episode where they found, I can't remember the name of it now, but they found a whole bunch of Borg survivors on a planet that wanted to be reconnected to a cooperative, not to necessarily the collective, but they wanted to be relinked to end their own like internal strife and such, right? So we definitely have seen some different aspects of a different approach to surviving the collective. So, yeah.
And they addressed that again in that episode where her 3 former, Unimatrix friends show up and they're looking for her to undo what they did so that they can die peacefully or something like that. It's just, Borg medical ethics, they don't exist. So were there any other episodes that you had on your head when we were talking about doing this spot?
I think we hit.
I obviously thought of Picard and his artificial heart.
Sure.
Getting the Q episode where he has to see what his life would have been like if he didn't go through that situation. I forget what that episode is called, but
Tapestry.
Thank you. That kind of makes me think about just the amazement of medical technology that they did have in the time, where they can simply do a set of holographic lungs, have an artificial heart. Those are all things that would be amazing to have this time of year, this time of the century that we live in. One of the biggest things that I think would be useful is the transporter. That's the other thing that I was thinking to talk about, is that I'm coming from the EMT perspective, and our biggest job as an EMT is just get the person to the hospital, get them to a higher level of care. And essentially, if you had a transporter system on Earth, you wouldn't need an ambulance because everyone could be at the hospitals within 2 seconds if they had the ability to transport. I'm actually kind of curious what you guys think of the technology. If there's one piece of future medical technology that you would like to see today, what would that be for you?
Personally, I would like to see sedatives that work as quickly as those hypo sprays.
There you go.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody's ever had somebody trying to eat their face and you're waiting on Dr. Versed to make that person sleepy, but it doesn't happen as fast as it does on TV.
Yep.
Yeah,
So,
there's got to be some kind of amazing catalyst in those things that's just like down. I was thinking about the transporter, and we've seen the transporter have some very interesting uses, particularly in Unnatural Selection, where Dr. Pulaski's hair is used to rejuvenate her to a younger state, and in Rascals, where the elder patterns of those 4 crew are used to restore them to an adult state. And it makes me wonder, sure, the transporter would be a great way to get somebody from a place to a hospital, but what if you already had their pattern on hand of their uninjured state? Could you just put them in the transporter buffer and then, recycle them to a healed state, but also maintain their memories of that? Just be like, oh yeah, we have this one where you workshop 31 times, so we're just going to beam that pattern to you. And then what does that say about the ethics of body, and how does that change concepts of injury and murder if you can just heal anybody in a flash?
Yeah, there's a body horror aspect to that too, right? Like they beam you out and you're missing an arm, and then you appear and suddenly you've got your arm back. There's some freak out there.
That's
no,
gonna, that's gonna be really, really weird phantom limb syndrome. If you don't have it, then you do, and whew.
Yeah, for me, it's definitely the replicator. The idea that hospitals had shortages of goods during the last 2 years of COVID, or of medicine specifically, then, we could just fix it. We'll just make 800 more vials, tap, 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 and now we've got the supplies that we needed, or whatever it may be. That's the bit of technology that I always find most basically magical in Trek, and it has applications to basically every facet of everything.
Let's not talk about how handy one of these little trinkets would be, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
The ability to just
Absolutely.
instantly and accurately diagnose all the conditions right away, and then just program a vial in the hypo spray. All right, you're good. Next.
Yeah, a portable MRI that just tells you exactly what's wrong anyways.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, just being able to get somebody's vital signs without having to hook them up to 30 feet of wires that are gonna, you're gonna have to pray over to make sure that they're all working correctly because the person's got a intention tremor. Yeah, I think probably the medical tricorder would be my personal big get, but that could just be me speaking from not wanting to be annoyed by having to acquire all that information manually.
Right. The analog component to the tricorder. We've talked a lot about Bashir, Phlox, the EMH. We've touched on Culber. We touched a little bit about Beverly. We haven't said anything about McCoy, and I want to wonder, is that just because our generation gap with TOS? Are we just not as learned about TOS, or are there situations in TOS where McCoy actually does something questionable or exceedingly great in a medical capacity?
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with the original series as I am. The one thing that I do remember, it's from I think of Voyage Home, the movie with the whales, where he gives a woman a pill to cure her renal failure, so she no longer has to do dialysis. And from a medical ethical standpoint, that's fine. From a temporal ethical standpoint, that's probably not great.
Yeah.
Because, but I guess they're already kidnapping marine
whales,
biologists and humpback whales. So fuck it. What's a pair of kidneys?
Yeah,
It was definitely a moment there where he's just annoyed with this entire hospital. Medievalisms, it's the bloody Middle Ages and such, right? And
sounds like
he's
the
just like,
goddamn Spanish Inquisition.
he bumps into a lady that's just like, oh, I need new kidneys. I've been on dialysis, and he's like, here, take 2 of these. Don't call me in the morning. Go away, kind of thing, right? It wasn't like he had like a moment of consideration there. It was just like, I can fix this real quick. Don't worry.
Which I guess makes me wonder what those pills do, because it's not like he's carrying around fix your kidney pills, because that's a very rarefied use of a drug to just have on your hands. So like, is that just the standard this cures most human long-term illness pill that they have that we never see?
Well, the way she phrases her response when she's asked why she's celebrating is, I grew a new kidney, right? So maybe it's some sort of like regenerative enhancement thing, so that anything that's like an organ failure, it kind of helps you get through in rapid sense.
We do a thing now where we use like a maybe, I don't know the chemical specifically, but like a radioactive iodine to find problems, when for things like what's that intestinal issue, if you have like little holes in your intestines?
Ulcers?
No, my grandma had it. It's like you can't eat seeds because they'll get caught, and then the holes, I don't know. Anyway,
diverticulitis.
That's it. Yes, they did a treatment for diverticulitis, and they actually perforated her colon. They needed to use radioactive iodine to figure out where the perforation was. It makes me wonder if that pill is like a radioactive iodine analog in the future. That's like, let's find where all the problems are, and then it's like, oh, there's a missing kidney here. Just use some material
it's a smart
there.
pill.
But that also brings into question, like, I had the same question about like Wolverine. How can he heal without eating 80 trillion calories a day? Like, that matter just can't populate from nowhere. So was her metabolism just like supercharged? Is there an adrenal catalyst in that pill that does the thing? I mean, all kinds of just out there. Yeah.
I mean, it's how Star Trek cures radiation, right? Like, there's no real understanding to it. There's no real, like, inoculation for gamma rays that you can give anybody. They're literally high energy particles that bust through your DNA and cause cancer later on. But somehow in Star Trek, here's the hypo spray. You're good for 6 hours of radiation now. It's like, there's no concept for how that would work yet. But, I mean, you can swallow it on face value and just move on, because that's the story.
I'm just thinking about how you conduct a multi-trillion cell protection thing with a hypospray to prevent the breakdown of those cell membranes. But
yeah, the best I can give you is some sort of like, it introduces a bacteria into you that eats radioactive decay, right? Like, because those exist. We found those in like the ruins of Chernobyl and such. So like, it adds something that has a very short shelf life to your system that just wants to eat radioactive stuff. Something like that's the best I can give you.
I'm trying to think about more medical applications. My best experience with bones is the movies. And I think the only part that really is questionable for me is, why would McCoy have access to the medical knowledge on Klingons that he would have needed to be more effective in helping Gorkon? Or would the Klingon anatomy just be completely evasive to Federation medical knowledge? I don't know.
Well, even by Crusher's time, remember, knowledge of the whole like backup organs thing was still pretty, like, she was kind of surprised that he's got 2 of everything almost, right? Like, she knew it was there, but she didn't really have much experience with it. So I could see where, a century earlier, McCoy would have just been like, I thought this was his heart. What's this beating thing over here, right? I can't imagine that the Federation like condoned like forced autopsies on Klingon bodies after battlefields or anything, right? Like, they're not going to study the bodies of the dead. I don't think Starfleet was ever doing that. So he may not have had much knowledge at all.
Yeah.
Just imagine being a doctor in that time would be an extremely difficult job, because you would be dealing with all these different types of aliens and species you've never dealt with. There's people that spend their entire lives here just how to treat a human and learning about the human body, and then you have to add all these different types of creatures on top of it.
You want a really good example of McCoy being brilliant? When it came to the poisoning of Sarek in Babel 1, having to use Andorian blood to potentially try and save him, that whole thing was very, very smart, right? Like finding a compatible blood donor amongst various other alien races and such, that all was pretty cool.
Yeah, I have only watched through TOS one whole time, and not a lot of that. I do recall there being an animated series episode where McCoy has to go on trial for some kind of cure that he tried to give out a few decades earlier that seemed to be killing some people, but ultimately he's exonerated because there's falsified information or he was framed or something like that. Yeah, wow. Have there ever...
Have you guys watched Lower Decks yet, by chance?
I haven't had a chance.
Okay. I recommend it, Mark. It's fantastic. I think you'll probably find Dr. Ta'ana to be one of your favorite Star Trek doctors once you get a couple episodes of her.
I guess if I could jump in, I would like to. I've shit on Bashir a good bit. I would like to defend him a little bit. I actually did really like the. I don't remember the name of the episode, but the episode where Vedic Bareil dies. I thought that was a really good handling of we have somebody who has a degenerative illness that is ultimately going to kill them, and the treatments are not going to, because if you have human beings in the real world who have very serious neurological disorders, they change over time, and that is deeply painful for the people in their lives. And there are questions about, should we treat somebody if they're going to come out the other side of that treatment not themselves? And in that episode, I think they handle the conversation that Bareil has with, say, Kira about, I don't want to be alive anymore if I'm not going to be me. I'm willing to die if it means I can accomplish this goal. And I think the way that they handled Bareil's wishes in terms of his medical care is probably one of the better examples of medical ethics that would jive with our modern understanding of them in any of the shows that I've seen. And they do a good job of showing how painful it can be for the loved ones of patients who are exerting their autonomy and their medical decision making that you still have to respect.
Yeah, the episode is life support for the listeners in case you want to watch that one again. It's a good one for sure.
What about the episode?
That brings up an interesting discussion too, of that sometimes the hardest part in the medical field is not dealing with the patient, but it's dealing with the family of the patient. And that's a thing that a lot of people don't even really understand or realize, possibly. But sometimes the patient is okay with what's happening to them, or at least understanding what's happening to them, and it's the family members that you're having to talk to or explain. They're the ones that are creating a real dramatic situation, especially when it comes to a traumatic incident or injury, or people that have terminal illnesses who maybe have come to accept their fate, but their spouse or their kids don't, and when you go to transport them or deal with them, the patient's fine. They're not upset. They're obviously not happy they're in that situation, but they're at peace with it. And it's the family that's creating the real issues. Yeah. You don't see many families in Star Trek, so you have the main characters, but you don't have a lot of families associated with those main characters.
Well, you don't see a lot of families like making a fuss out of it, and maybe that belies a little bit of the understanding that the medical professionals know more than you do, and you have to trust them to do the right thing.
Yeah, I think in like modern cases, it comes down to we're very bad at educating people like about medical things. Like I've talked to like a lot of like terminally ill patients who have, say, do not resuscitate orders, and a lot of times the family understands what that means, but a lot of times they don't. They're just not like, and this is like in many cases an economic thing, but like if you're like poor or from an otherwise marginalized community, in many cases the medical establishment is not particularly interested in taking the time to treat you like a human being, and treat you like an intelligent person who's capable of even understanding like an ethical conundrum and actually walking you through the ethical steps of what's involved in a do not resuscitate order. So people are walking around with family members who are terminally ill, who they understand the situation, though often not, and then the families are just completely, they don't know what's going on, and at the point of that person's death is not the time to be having that conversation. But unfortunately, that's very often when that conversation happens, and it's truly tragic.
Yep.
Yeah, well said.
Which is one of the reasons I actually really like that episode, because like they do go out of their way to really explore the weight of those situations in a way that I think we don't often do in the real world today. So that was an area where Star Trek did better than we do, for sure.
Well, they have the benefit of having a set time window too, right? Where they can tell their whole story. They don't have like the frantic sobbing of family members who just don't understand for hours on end. So they've got some advantages over you, don't worry.
Yeah, they got a writing staff and a showrunner.
There are a couple of episodes that I can think of where they do share family moments. There was I don't want to talk about this episode too much. I want to talk about the other episode second, whatever. But the Voyager episode Emanations, where Harry Kim ends up on a world where they basically deposit their dead on a moon that's been mummified, and the family there is very much about like, you need to go on to your next emanation. This is just how it's done. And the guy himself doesn't want to go on to his next emanation. And he's like, well, let's just mummify Harry Kim and pretend he's me, and we'll send him off to the moon, and I'll go live my happy life out in the woods where I want to go. The family that there kind of pleads the case that you need to do this. There's the TNG episode, Half a Life, where, pre-Ro Michelle Forbes, as the daughter of Timison, is pleading for him to go through their planet's suicide ritual because you're 60 now, it's time to go, Dad. But then there's the episode that I like the most, which is, I think it's just called The Blight, where Bashir, they find this planet that's been decimated by a disease infected by the Dominion, and family members are coming to this native doctor who is helping people find peace before the blight quickens, or as the blight quickens. And people come to him, and he gives them this ointment or drink that is basically assisted suicide. But in all three of these cases, the family members are essentially pleading with the person who is to die, basically, to go through with that. And so that's definitely the opposite of what happens here, where the family members are like, no, don't die.
Yeah.
They weren't just pleading. In some of those cases, they were kind of pushing it on and almost forcing them to go through with it.
Right.
I think in general, especially in the United States, death is kind of hidden. There's not a lot of people that have really experienced death or even see death. So it's very scary when it actually hits your family and you're experiencing and dealing with it firsthand. Other societies on our planet view death in a very different way than I think the United States does. The Half a Life episode, that was with David Ogden Stiers, right? That was
correct.
The episode with, yeah, that's the one. I think I like the Michelle Roddenberry aspect of that, where she was the one kind of speaking up and encouraging him to not necessarily having to go through with it. I always forget that Michelle Forbes was in that episode too. But Emanations is another interesting episode dealing with how a culture handles their dead and encourages them to go through the proper process. Harry's the one who kind of steps up. So again, it's like Prime Directive coming into play here. These different people interfering with a society and giving their opinion of how to handle different things. And it's more ethical dilemmas to talk about.
And that being the case, The Blight is the one episode that I really wanted to try and dig into, is, in terms of medical treatment, ethics, the spirit of the show. What's your take on Bashir's actions here?
Well, so I think first I want to say that the doctor, or the maybe not doctor is the best word, but the person in that community who was providing end of life care, which is what I'll term it, for those people, I have absolutely no problems with what they were doing. I think that's a natural cultural development for those people. And what I think you see in that episode is it was also good for another reason, which is it was a humbling of Bashir, and by extension, I think a humbling of the audience who is meant to identify with the Federation, which is that you cannot, just because you are a technologically advanced, quote unquote, culturally advanced civilization, swoop into some place and figure everything out in the course of a 45-minute episode. And very often, if you interject yourself into a situation where you don't have a full understanding of it, the end result is going to be suffering, which is what happened when Bashir tried to save those people, and did so without any understanding of what was happening. And the end result was three or four, I think, people, if not more, ultimately suffered immense pain at the end of their lives that they otherwise wouldn't have. So I think that's that's like a top level look at it. In terms of Bashir's individual actions, I think that we can understand and have sympathy for what he was doing initially while still critiquing it. And then I think his actions post taking the time to understand what was happening are fairly admirable. You see in later episodes that he's still quietly working on a cure for the quickening. And doing it in a way that is not like paternalistic and authoritative over those people, but trying to help them on their own terms, which is what he should have done in the first place.
So I want to veer to a slightly different science fiction franchise. Just It's possible you guys have watched The Orville. I can't be sure. It is very TNG-esque.
I saw like 3 episodes of it.
I don't remember if it's in the first 3, but so there's a race in that show called the Moclans, right? And they proclaim themselves to be a single-sex species. They only have males, right? Early on in that show, though, we learned that that's just not true. They have females that are born into their species. It's just not common. It's like one every decade sort of thing. Their medical professionals enforce a conversion onto those individuals, right? Like, whether they consent or not, that's what the state insists must happen, right? So we've definitely seen some dystopian presentations in science fiction, right? Are there any times that you guys have seen an episode and just been like, holy shit, that's disgusting, from like a medical ethics perspective or from a healthcare perspective perspective on it?
I think the Orville is actually a good example. I have seen the Orville, and the whole forcing a medical decision on somebody in general, even if it's a small decision, is one that would be unethical, in my opinion. I'm trying to think of a good Star Trek example that's similar to that Orville episode.
I would like to offer The Outcast.
Is that the one where they force the gender identity on the alien? Yeah, that was what I was thinking as well. Yeah, that was... So I think that's a good example of where I interface with the ethics of Star Trek in general, because I am of the mind that you have every right as a culture to determine your ethics, and I have every right to disagree with them and argue with you about what those are, but I don't have the right to force my view on you, is kind of where I draw the line. And I think I would have a very, very long, very drawn-out argument with that civilization, and I'm also not obligated to participate in your culture either, so I'm perfectly comfortable not interfering directly with your culture, but if any of your people want to come to me and live lives according to how they feel is the most actualizing to who they are, I'm perfectly willing to provide shelter to those people too, which is what I think is what Riker was trying to do, though he did it a little more imperialistically than I might have.
Yeah.
You should give the Orville a watch then,
Yeah.
because that same question with this Mach 1 species does come up in their second season, right? Like, they're an important. Think of them as the equivalent of the Vulcans in Starfleet, right?
Mhm.
They threaten to leave the Federation in the middle of a war because they're starting to offer harbor to women who have fled their planet, essentially, right? Like, they make it a big deal. Oh, you're gonna aid criminals from our society. We're leaving, essentially, is their reaction to it. So it's quite a crippling threat. But yeah, you should definitely give it a watch then. They
Yeah.
address this philosophy behind this pretty well in the episodes too.
Yeah, I'll check that out for sure then.
But yeah, going back to the question though, Jeff, do you have any other examples of like terrible malpractice or like horrible philosophy behind things that's going on in Starfleet's medicine that's just offensive to you at any level?
Oh boy. So I think dealing with things like going back to Barclay and holodeck addiction and transporter psychosis, those type of issues. Not so much horrifying to me, but it seems like that's a topic that I really would have liked them to explore a little bit more. I think it's an interesting idea of if we had a true holodeck nowadays, there would be people that would be addicted to that and spend their entire lives in there.
I mean, Barclay's definitely coded, what we'd call now, he's coded neurodivergent, right? At the time, they didn't have the language for that, but that's essentially what he's used as. He's the weird kid in school that doesn't think like everybody else, but we're putting him to use, right? So it was definitely progressive in its time, but from a modern context, it's almost belittling the way they talk to him or talk about him while he's next to them. So yeah, there's definitely improvements to be thought of for how they treat the character, and certainly not getting his name wrong in front of mixed company, right? Like with senior officers getting called broccoli.
Ooh, yeah.
Real bad.
Yeah, I actually really
Probably one of
liked-
the most horrifying things is I think of the Vidians. Obviously not Starfleet, but having a race of people that are actually going around and stealing organs, that's a pretty horrifying idea. But you understand their motivation, obviously, is to keep themselves alive. So that's another interesting thing that you'd have to deal with.
Remember, they also not just took body parts, they also took genetic material to grow clones, would experiment on races to take experiments on people, anything they could do to survive. It was definitely ends justifying their means there, just survival. So there's definitely a lot of medical horror questions that come up as a result of the Vidian storylines on Voyager.
The reverse Tuvix with B'Elanna as her two different selves.
Yeah.
Mark, you were going to say something?
Oh, I was going to say, I actually liked the way that I feel like the writers of Star Trek and the various iterations of it kind of understood, at least a little bit, where they fucked up with Barclay. As you can see, like, his character evolve over the franchise and start to become well respected, and his prior, like, the things that he was like made fun of in previous episodes are now seen as like just character traits of Barclay that are part of who he is in the Voyager episodes. It's not 100%, like there's still problems with how he's portrayed in Voyager, but I think they tried, which is something. It's not nothing. I wish they would have done better though, but I think that they did at least try to evolve that character in a way that is better presenting of who he is supposed to be, which is coded as neurodivergent.
I think you're completely right. Yeah, by the time that he was in Voyager, he's definitely getting a bit more respect. He's still considered like the odd duck, the one that needs a little bit of extra hand holding to get up through his day, but he's definitely respected, and he's definitely in charge of something that's pretty important towards the end of that show. The Midas Array entire storyline was great.
Well, and part of the acceptance that we see in Barclay's arc is he goes from being called broccoli by the experts on the flagship, the best of the best, to everybody just calling him Reg. Everybody from First Contact onwards, like I'm sure they called him Barclay at some point, but in all of his appearances post First Contact into Voyager, Deanna calls him Reg. Everybody on Voyager calls him Reg. Everybody at Project, whatever the project he's on, trying to get Voyager home.
Pathfinder.
Pathfinder.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Everybody there calls him Reg. There's definitely in the power of names, the way that we give people power with names, going from somebody who was misnamed to someone who's, you know, diminutive for their formal name is now the familiar name. This speaks volumes. You know, when you first enter a crowd and there's, you know, maybe there's some kind of in joke where somebody says something about you and that just becomes your nickname, and then everybody just calls you that and you're all aware of it. It's all fun and games. Definitely speaks to Reg's acceptance in society. I just wanted to call back to the Blight real quick and be like, Dax, like, hacking and slashing at Bashir and the audience by being like, you know, it's probably pretty arrogant to think that you could find a cure, but it's even more arrogant to think that there's not one just because you couldn't find it. I was just like, that's perfect writing right there. Just slap the audience out of its comfort zone, slap Bashir out of his comfort zone. I think the quickening takes place before we find out Bashir's genetically augmented too.
I think so.
So,
Yeah.
you know, when you watch that episode again, knowing that he's this, you know, criminal genius, literally, it just, you know, it speaks volumes about Bashir's determination, and maybe is even a milestone in the maturity of the character, because as we all know, when he comes aboard, he's basically just the doctor who's chasing Dax around DS9.
Well, I mean, Star Trek has definitely shown us some diseases that are mystifying, essentially. The phage, the Vidians have had to deal with it for 2,000 years. It's been a pandemic across their entire race. It's changed the way the society functions. It's ruined their relations with other races. It's like a transformative event. And then the Doctor makes legitimate progress on actually curing it in a matter of weeks. Right? And that just goes to show us not that the Vidians were dumb or that they couldn't solve it themselves, but that a new perspective really changes how you approach something, right? A new background can cause you to reevaluate how you treat a medical condition. So we've got a lot that we can learn from that kind of idea too. So Jeff or Mark, either one of you guys, have you guys ever had one of those situations where just a colleague from, say, a different field or a different line is just approaching something differently than you, and you feel like you learn a lot because of it?
Well, I think it's a good reason to always get a second opinion on things, especially when it comes to the medical field. I was in a very bad motorcycle accident a number of years ago and broke both of my legs and had to go through physical therapy, and that's one of the main reasons why I stopped working as an EMT, is because I just couldn't do it anymore. And I had an issue with my leg where you didn't really understand or agree with the first doctor, so you get a second opinion with the second doctor. The second doctor sends you to the third doctor, and you kind of go through this whole process of trying to get someone who will understand what you're saying, believe what you're saying, and actually find a solution or come up with an idea. And that's good in medicine, to have that ability, but it's also frustrating for people to have to go through that type of process. But not everyone knows everything, and every injury is different, every situation is different. So you can't expect that the first and only doctor you go to is going to be the one that will be able to solve your problems and make you better.
Oh, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say just from an outside perspective, I have, so working 911, a lot of our patient population is opiate overdoses. And that is when you're dealing with a population who habitually uses narcotics, there are some very, very, very negative attitudes in public safety towards that patient population. I'm not going to reiterate many of the terrible things I've heard paramedics and EMTs say about IV drug users here, but they're many times not great. Whereas I personally have a history of narcotics abuse. I was a drug addict for many years, and prior to becoming a paramedic, and I've had several friends die of narcotics overdoses. And I'm very quick to remind my coworkers who say things like, well, we should, just wake people up from an overdose once, and if you don't get your shit together after that, we let you die. I'm very quick to speak to my coworkers about that, and once you I found once you humanize the patient for somebody and say, hey, this is something that this person might not have as much control over as you think. This is not just a problem for you to deal with. This is a human being with a family who is going to cry over them if they don't wake up. I've actually found I've changed a fair number of minds of people who were previously very hostile. And I think that's important, is being able to offer somebody another perspective. In terms of my own perspective being changed, I actually was not aware of how thoroughly toxic the mental health care inpatient hospitals were in this country to transgendered people, in terms of, like, in many places they will deny you your hormone replacement therapy if it's not prescribed explicitly for that purpose. I wasn't aware of that until I started making trans friends and hanging out with trans people who had interacted with that system. And, I'd spent 7 years in healthcare, taking people to inpatient mental health care facilities. And that changed a lot for me as well, in terms of, understanding and empathizing with a particular patient population. Like, I think you can always learn something that will make you a better person by interacting with people at their own level.
Yeah, as a man who is now married to a man who went through that experience of transitioning, not physically, but adopting a new name and, male pronouns, I have entered a whole new world of experiences that I was just completely oblivious about. And it has definitely tried to open my heart. And I feel a little bit like you, where I try to speak up and be like, whoa, 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 we're talking about people here. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious, Mark, how do you think Star Trek dealt with addiction? Because we've seen it a couple times, like with the game and the holodeck addiction, and there's individual episodes, but no real prolonged storylines.
Well, I'd like to add to that before Mark answers the question. We've seen it weaponized in the Jem'Hadar too.
Yeah. That's such a good example for it too.
Yeah, I would say overall not great. I've not been pleased with how they handled it. In the early episodes, it was mostly, dare, like, if you smoke one marijuana, you will become the criminals and die in a gutter. Yeah, there's just not been a lot of nuance there. Like, the entire planet of junkies who are, like, scratchy fiending, and it's... I didn't like that too much. That
was the symbiosis episode, I think.
Yeah. And most people, I think, who, and I'm going to try to avoid getting on a spiel about how, like, I think we should have safe injection sites everywhere and all that stuff, but I think drug addiction is a problem in a population when drug addiction is criminalized rather than being treated like a healthcare problem. And despite having the resources to treat addiction like a healthcare problem or a pain management problem or some sort of other mental health care problem, Star Trek has all the resources for that. They very often treat it as a individual personal failure. And it does have kind of a puritanical attitude towards it that I'm not too comfortable with. In terms of the Jem'Hadar, I mean, I see the Gem. I'm a big believer in, like, moral luck, and I see the Jem'Hadar as just profoundly unlucky. And I think that they were created as slaves to do the bidding of another species. And one of my favorite episodes of DS9 actually was the one where Bashir and O'Brien find themselves on that planet with the one Jem'Hadar who just happened to not need the white and was trying to get his squad off of it to resist the Dominion, and ultimately failed because he just happened to be genetically, he was a fluke. It's not something, like, they truly were fundamentally dependent on it for their survival. And I think that was a really interesting exploration of what that would do to a species if you essentially bred into them a lack of agency, which is what that really is. I don't know that the Jim Hadar Ketracel White thing really, it's coded maybe as drug addiction, but I think more accurately it's probably in the minds of the show's creators just seen as like an added extra layer of control. So I don't get too miffed about that. I think it was just a narrative device and they didn't think too hard about it.
Yeah, no, Ira Bear, one of the creators on it, has definitely said that it's coded addiction / religion, both at the same time, right? Like it would be like being addicted to opium because God wants you to be addicted to opium is essentially how he's coded it.
That's literally it, though. The founders want you to be addicted to this stuff, so go right ahead.
Like if you were physically addicted to communion wine.
Exactly. That's a great way to look at it. Yeah.
But you know, it also seems like the founders were existentially afraid of people like Omediclon, who had the genetic, you know, immunity, didn't need the Ketracel White or whatever it was, and that might be why they programmed it in anyway. Maybe there was like a first race of Jem Hadar who tried to turn against the founders, and so they made them chemically addicted in order to stem that tide. That's terrible.
Going back to it though, Jeff, you have a chance here as well to say the same.
As far as addiction,
Yeah.
or as far as
Addiction and the Jem Hadar, like the whole.
yeah. I mean, I'm lucky that I haven't had any addiction problems in my life or my family's life, really. But being an EMT, you'd see it every day, and you'd see how mental health would play into that as well. I think Star Trek obviously has touched on it in a few situations. I agree that I don't think they've really done a very good job at it. Going back to mental health in general, they did what they could for the 90s. I think they're doing better now. Maybe that's a storyline that Discovery or Picard could pick up and try and do something with. Because even in the future, I think there's clearly, you do see drugs in Discovery in one episode, but it's just kind of touched on and then not look back. I think it's something that, since a lot of people do deal with or have a history of, or family has a history of, it would be nice to see in Star Trek and handled a little different way.
We do see a little bit of it in Picard with Raffi's snakeweed, I believe is the name,
That's
addiction, which is probably just coded pot, but something along those lines.
Yeah.
I actually thought the ethanol thing was really interesting because, if I'm not mistaken, within the context of the series, synthahol,
Yeah.
Synthahol, the gist of that is you can just get as tore the fuck up as you want, but you're one hypo spray away from being sober, or something to that effect.
It's supposed to be even easier than that. It's supposed to just be like you can essentially push it out of your brain instantly,
Just
kind
will
of thing, right?
yourself
Like
sobriety.
will yourself into sobriety instantly, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting that they, and I understand why they did it, but that they did that specifically, that analog with alcohol, whereas there are so many other just better drugs that you could do that with. Like, I would imagine once you remove the ability to become addicted to a substance, presumably you can't become addicted to synthahol either. I don't know if that's ever stated or not, but either that or everybody on the show is an alcoholic because they're always in 10 forward.
Sorry.
And you remove the negative cognitive effects. Like, why isn't 10 forward serving synth heroin, right? Like, I feel like synth opium, right? Like, it's just interesting that they carried forward the sort of like weirdly puritanical attitude that America has 400 years in the future, where alcohol's okay, to the extent that Picard has the real stuff and he's seen as cooler for it. Alcohol's fine, but this game that you spend all your time playing that's bad because it's like a heroin analog.
Right.
So there's definitely some of this is carried over right from Roddenberry himself, right? So early on during TOS's production, they were originally approached to do like cigarette commercials with the main cast, and Roddenberry was like, no, we're not having smoking on the Enterprise. It's absolutely not possible, right? And at the time, the dangers of nicotine and tobacco weren't quite as clear, but there was already some inkling on it. So he just banned it there. It's not until like Picard, Star Trek Picard, where we see a main character positively using like a cigar, right, frequently, and we see Rios doing it all the time in every scene. Basically, he's got something in his lips, right? So it was quite a while until we jumped that. Okay, well, Roddenberry's specific fixation on this doesn't have to be carried forward. We'd seen characters here and there, right, but most on like holodecks and such. But yeah, so there's definitely some aspects. It's not just American puritanicism. It was specifically Roddenberry's view on some things.
Yeah, that's well said.
The other episode that actually is analogous to drug addiction that just popped in my head was Garrick's wire in his head. That was a pretty good. I don't know if they addressed it directly within the text of the episode, but the subtext is just, it's about a drug addiction.
Oh yeah, the little wire that you can willingly induce the happy chemicals, and he lives on it for 2 years before. And somebody who has also never had to deal with addiction either personally or adjacently. How did that episode reflect withdrawal? Is that an okay?
Yeah, I mean it's a little dramatic in some places and under dramatic in others, but like on balance, I think that actually was a really good portrayal of somebody who was trying to come to terms with the cessation of something that they were both physically and psychologically dependent on. I think the episode ends in 45 minutes and we don't really see the long-term struggle that he has to deal with every day. It also helps that he is not actually able to go out and get more happy brain wires. Like that makes it easier for him. So he physically is incapable of relapsing. But yeah, overall, I thought that was a pretty good portrayal of that whole process for that character. It's Star Trek, so I'll give it a 10 for Star Trek and like a 7 for like a show that was trying to do that. Because Star Trek, we love it, but sometimes with the social stuff, it can get a little astray.
Yeah. Jeff, any thoughts to that end?
I think that's again, it's not having to deal with it in my own life, but I have seen people in stages of withdrawal. They seem to be a fairly reasonable patient. And it's kind of an interesting thought too. If they had the ability to give him that happy brain wire, like you say, and control his happiness, that's another whole ethical argument of would that be something that people would become addicted to, and how could that maybe be used for good reasons for people that are dealing with chronic issues or chronic pain. That's something that you could maybe flip and actually use to help people if properly supervised and controlled. That'd be something that'd be very interesting to me.
Yeah, that same subject actually comes up in some of the beta canon stuff. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it much, but there's a game called Star Trek Borg, and one of the characters in it, Anastasia Targus, also had that same brain wire hooked up to her by Cardassians, and it was used both as torture and pain and then pleasure and reward, just to force her into giving up information over and over and over, to the point where even after she's been rescued, she needs to have like a white noise generator on it just so she doesn't go crazy from its complete absence. When it's removed from her, it causes severe and automatic withdrawal symptoms from the lack of stimulation that comes from it. So yeah, the subject isn't something that's just in the one episode. It does come up in beta canon here and there.
Cool. I actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I do think if I had a critique of that episode or like a specific criticism, it would be that it is coded as negative like it's not, like you said, there are positive potential uses for that technology, and like I would argue potentially that somebody who is an exile on a station that is climate controlled in every way that is horrible for them. They encounter people who despise them every waking moment of their life. Their life is essentially a nightmare for them. If you have that type of technology, is it necessarily ethically bad for that person to choose to use something that makes it bearable for them to live if there are no negative physical consequences of it? It's coded as being bad on principle. And I would argue that it's not, that that's actually something that probably should be dealt with more in a more nuanced way, that the show didn't really get into.
Wow.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point, right? Sometimes how do I phrase it? The potential benefits of a technology don't get as much attention as the obvious negatives on them. So you're definitely right there.
And I think we have demonstrated it in talking about it in several different places in this episode that Cardassian medical technology is ridiculously advanced and almost always used sadistically, which is very sad for the people in general. But like, we're talking about the positive applications of this wire. What about the positive applications of the pain device used on Picard in Chain of Command? Or, you know, as we discussed earlier, Krell Mozet's horrible tactics, but also tried to use positively to cure B'Elanna.
Well, let's not forget, right? The original coding or the original message use of the Cardassians was to be like Nazi analogs, right? Like, and the Bajorans was to be pretty similar to like Jewish refugees, basically, right? Like that was where a lot of the original coding for both of those races came from. So, you know, Krell Mazet is quite literally Mengele, and the Nazis' advances in medicine are what these Cardassian advances are supposed to be analogous to. So, yeah, there's a reason why these comparisons come up. It's not accidental.
For sure. I think we've run the course of time for what we have available today. Jeff, Mark, thank you so much for being here with us today to talk about this. I hope that in the future, maybe we can do a more detailed focus or a dive into one or two particular episodes and really break those down. For the audience, I hope that you appreciate the contrast that we presented here and maybe thinking about these medical episodes and applications in different ways, and seeing the medical and psychological experiences of those around you in a more humane and different way as well. I know that I've definitely got a lot to think about after this conversation. So thank you very much. And to the viewers and listeners, thank you for always going boldly with Beyond Trek Podcast.
Thank you.
Hey everybody, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to our Patreon and Anchor supporters. Big thanks to Stephanie Baker, S. Tam, Anne Marie, Jim Cook, and Nora Hickson. We really appreciate your support. Thanks for being a part of Beyond Trek Podcast.
We are Beyond Trek Podcast. Lower your inhibitions and surrender your ears. We will add inspirational and hilarious Trek content to your day. Your attention will adapt to subscribe to us. Resistance is futile.